Okay, let's unpack this. We are embarking on a deep dive today that is purely American, deeply regional, and surprisingly complex. The secret history of moonshine. And this is a dive specifically tailored for you, the audience of Ashley County Now, as requested by K. Brad Barfield. We're using sources that, well, they range from global distilling history all the way to incredibly specific local Arkansas records and personal memoirs. The mission today is really clear. We want to get past those simplistic, often inaccurate stereotypes, the overalls and hidden stills. We want to understand moonshine as this really potent cultural force. It's a sophisticated story.
Absolutely. It's about logistics. It's about defiance against central authority, economic survival, and frankly, often incredibly dangerous craftsmanship practiced right there on the American frontier. We're basically tracking its history from like a centuries-old cultural inheritance all the way up to a modern commercialized product. And we're using Ashley County, Arkansas as our perfect microcosm to really understand these big sweeping forces.
Right. It brings it right down to the local level.
And the angle that kind of binds all these elements together, from the 1300s onward, as Brad mentioned, is pure, relentless logistical necessity. Just think about the physical challenge facing any farmer, whether they were, tucked away in some remote Appalachian Valley or, critically for this discussion, in the isolated great wilderness of southeast Arkansas.
Right.
How do you take a bulky, heavy crop like corn? It's difficult to transport, it spoils easily, yields a low price per pound. How do you turn that into a high-value, portable, non-perishable currency?
Distillation.
Exactly. The answer, distillation, was just an act of economic genius for them. And in that desperate, ingenious act, they inadvertently created the legendary federal revenuers to fight, and also those high-speed chases that would, believe it or not, eventually invent NASCAR.
It's an incredible chain reaction, isn't it? It really proves that necessity truly is the mother of invention, even if the invention happens to be illegal. So we're going to explore why this really foundational agricultural tradition immediately clashed with the brand new U.S. government. We'll dive deep into the precise, sometimes really dangerous science required to make a safe batch, and then we'll bring it all home to the specific conflicts, the characters, the company towns that define places like Parkdale and Crossett, right there in Ashley County.
Yeah, let's get into it.
All right, part one, the economics and culture of the still. So where does this tradition actually start?
Well, foundation of American distilling traditions, and by extension, moonshining, it doesn't begin with the Civil War or even the Revolutionary War. It starts way back across the Atlantic. Distilling arrived in the American South as a direct cultural inheritance. It was carried over by Scots-Irish immigrants, mostly in the 18th century.
And this cultural transfer is key, right?
Yeah.
These were folks settling the most remote frontiers, Appalachia, down through the Ozarks, and onto the difficult terrains of the Arkansas frontier.
Exactly. And they came from a land with a long, long history of whiskey making. For them, it was often considered kind of liquid bread, a secure, non-spoiling way to store their grain reserves through the winter months.
So making whiskey wasn't some radical or criminal act for them.
Not at all. It was a natural, almost expected continuation of their agricultural cycle. It really represented self-sufficiency and economic insurance in liquid form.
Okay, so it's just part of farming life.
Right. But this inherent tradition of self-sufficiency immediately clashed with the new and, frankly, cash-strapped U.S. government. Remember, after the massive debt from the Revolutionary War, the Founding Fathers desperately needed a stable source of revenue, and they looked at liquor, a widely produced, widely consumed product, and thought, well, that's the perfect target for an excise tax.
So the conflict started out economic, not moral.
Precisely. It wasn't initially about drunkenness or morality. It was a pure clash between sort of an agricultural culture's right to independent economic processing versus the central government's desperate need to tax and regulate commerce. They were essentially arguing over who owned the profit derived from a farmer's surplus grain.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's talk more about that corn, that currency aspect. What's truly fascinating here, I think, is how moonshining served as this really profound, practical, logistical, and economic solution for farmers who were just isolated by geography.
Yeah.
I mean, on the frontier, roads were often non-existent or just treacherous, muddy tracks. This was the very definition of value-added agriculture.
No, the economic necessity just cannot be overstated. Imagine you're an Arkansas farmer, say in the 1840s, living maybe 4 miles west of where Crossett is now, just trying to turn a profit. Your staple crop, corn. It's heavy, it's bulky, spoils really quickly, especially down in the humid climate of southeast Arkansas. Moving even a single wagon load of that corn over terrible roads to a distant market like Natchez or maybe Little Rock was just prohibitively expensive, time-consuming, and super risky. You might spend 2 weeks hauling corn, only to have the entire profit eaten up by transport costs and spoilage before you even get there.
So you distill it. You solve the whole logistical crisis by radically concentrating the value. You turn this massive volume of low-value, heavy crop into a small, extremely high-value, portable liquid.
Exactly. And our sources really drive home just how powerful this transformation was. Historically, a gallon of whiskey sold for roughly the same price as an entire 10-bushel barrel of corn.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Huge. You could fit hundreds of gallons of this concentrated value onto a single mule or a small wagon. It completely bypassed the tyranny of distance and, frankly, the lack of infrastructure.
So this is often the difference between just getting by and actually surviving economically.
Right. Absolutely. The income they got from the distilled product was frequently the only source of hard currency these rural families had access to. And they desperately needed that cash, not for luxuries, but to pay, say, local property taxes, which often had to be paid in federal dollars.
Right.
Or to purchase vital goods they couldn't make on the farm. Tools, maybe iron implements, sugar, salt, medical supplies, things like that.
And I read somewhere that sometimes the moonshine itself became currency.
That's right. This practice was so crucial that during extreme crises like the Great Depression in the 1930s, moonshine was reportedly used as a functioning form of currency itself in local barter economies. It just cements its role as this cornerstone of rural financial survival for generations.
Which inevitably leads to conflict with the taxman.
Right. A legacy of defiance.
This inherent conflict started almost immediately after the founding of the nation, didn't it? That post-Revolutionary War excise tax on spirits in 1791. That sparked the infamous Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. It established this powerful, really deep-seated American tradition of resisting federal taxation on domestic spirits.
Yeah, and that tradition, that sense of, principled defiance, it kind of lay dormant for a while until the next massive federal need for funding came along, the Civil War. In 1862, the federal government passed a new, much more sweeping liquor tax, specifically designed to fund the Union War effort.
And this one was different.
Oh, yeah. This tax was far more aggressive than the 1790s version, and it really institutionalized the conflict. It required the creation of a specialized class of federal tax collectors. They were from the Bureau of Internal Revenue, and they would become known universally as the legendary and, let's be honest, much feared revenuers.
This is where the story gets really personal and cultural, I think. For the moonshiner, whether they were way up in the remote Ozarks or deep in the Ashley County pines, this tax was seen as profoundly punitive. Illegitimate, even.
It was mandated by a distant federal authority in Washington, D.C., an authority that provided, few, if any, local services, no schools, no roads to speak of in return for the demanded payment. They were essentially being asked to pay a tax on their only viable cash crop to a government they barely ever saw or interacted with.
So that perspective gave them a powerful moral justification for evading the tax.
Absolutely. The act of running a still became transformed from just simple tax avoidance into the symbolic act of independence, resistance against what they saw as an overreaching centralized government.
And the local communities often supported them.
Yeah, the source material confirms this cultural stance. Local officials, local juries throughout the South and the Midwest frequently sided with moonshiners against federal agents. They often viewed the revenuer not as a legitimate lawman upholding necessary regulations, but as this intrusive, illegitimate agent of that distant, overreaching authority.
So it wasn't just a business dispute.
No, it was a cultural war, fought with copper stills, speed, and local jurisprudence.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Moving beyond the economics and the politics, let's talk about the sheer skill involved. The common stereotype is so simple, just throw some corn in a pot. But the reality of making a safe and palatable spirit seems to require real chemical precision, applied folk science that kind of defied that hillbilly image.
Whoa, absolutely. It starts with the mash, that foundational mixture. The ingredients were simple, traditional. Yeah, crushed corn, often flaked maize, maybe some malted barley. Sugar became common when corn prices were low, water, and yeast. But the application, how you use them, that was everything.
So walk us through that process. It sounds like temperature is critical.
It is. You begin by heating the water to approximately 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Then you stir in your crushed corn. Now, if you add the corn when the water's too cool, the gelatinization of the starch doesn't happen properly. If it's too hot, you kill the essential enzymes before they even start their work.
Okay.
Then, you have to wait until the temperature drops precisely to this critical sweet spot, around 152 degrees Fahrenheit, to introduce the crushed malted barley.
And why malted barley? What does that do?
This is the entire chemical key to making whiskey from corn. Malted barley is just barley that's been allowed to germinate slightly. That process activates natural enzymes, specifically amylase, and these enzymes break down the long, complex cornstarches into simple fermentable sugars, mostly maltose.
Right, which the yeast can then eat.
Exactly. If they added that malt at 165 degrees, the enzymes would denature, the conversion fails, and you're just left with a worthless, starchy sludge. No alcohol potential.
And the frontier distiller, they wouldn't have had a modern thermometer. How did they manage that?
Pure experience, visual cues, timing, feel. They had to know their craft intimately to hit that 152-degree mark consistently.
Okay, so after the malt.
Once that conversion is complete, the mixture, now it's called the wash, has to cool even further, down to a temperature of around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, before you can introduce the yeast. If that wash is too hot, even like 80 or 90 degrees, the yeast just dies. Fermentation stops dead. You've wasted days of effort and valuable grain.
So this careful management really shows the moonshiner as, well, a highly skilled artisan, practicing what's essentially small batch biochemistry under pretty intense pressure.
Definitely. Once the yeast is finally added, the fermentation process begins. It lasts anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks, depending on conditions. During this time, the yeast converts those sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide, turning that carefully prepared wash into a potent liquid ready for the next step, distillation.
Which brings us to the centerpiece of the whole operation, the still itself. Now, you mentioned earlier connecting this back to the bigger picture. The material choice for the still, almost always copper. That's pure practical chemistry, right? Not just tradition.
Precisely. During fermentation, yeast naturally produces sulfur compounds. If those get carried over into the final product, they impart this truly foul, sour, almost metallic taste. Copper acts as an essential catalyst. When the hot alcohol vapor passes through the copper walls of the still, the copper reacts with these sulfur compounds. It effectively filters them out by forming copper sulfate, which just stays behind in the still. So this simple material choice purifies the alcohol vapor, ensuring a much smoother, better tasting, cleaner product.
Makes sense. So what are the main parts of a traditional pot still? It looks complicated.
It requires meticulous construction, for sure. There are basically 4 main functional components. First, you've got the pot or boiler. That's where the fermented wash is heated over the fire.
Oh.
Second, the swan neck or column, which rises up from the pot. That's where the vapors first begin to separate as they rise. Third, you have the line arm. That's basically the piping that transports the hot vapor away from the heat source towards the cooling stage.
And the last part cools it down.
Right. And finally, the condenser. Often it's a coiled copper tube known as the worm, which is submerged in a large barrel of cold, ideally running, water. This rapid cooling forces the hot alcohol vapor to condense back into liquid, which then trickles out into your collection jar or jug.
And building this required real skill, and I imagine it was dangerous too.
Absolutely. The construction demanded substantial metalworking skill and, crucially, extreme attention to safety. All the joints and seals had to be perfectly airtight. Any leak allowed those highly flammable ethanol vapors to escape and potentially contact the fire source. That created a substantial risk of fire or explosion, which was always a major hazard, especially out on the frontier.
Okay, this next part seems absolutely crucial, but maybe the most important detail for understanding why moonshine historically carried such a severe, often deadly, health risk. It's not just running the still, it's separating the distillate into these precise fractions, right? Making the cuts.
Right.
Because the composition and the safety changes dramatically throughout the run.
Yes, this is paramount. The primary source of acute, instant danger lies right at the very beginning of the run. This is known as the 4 shots. It comprises roughly the first 5% of the collected liquid. Because ethanol and these other volatile compounds boil at slightly different temperatures, the most dangerous chemicals actually boil off and come over first.
And the 4 shots contain what exactly?
Highly toxic compounds, most notoriously methanol and ethyl acetate. This fraction must be responsibly discarded, period.
And methanol is the really dangerous one.
Extremely. The chemical mechanics here are terrifying. Methanol is metabolized by the human liver not into relatively harmless acetic acid like ethanol is, but into formaldehyde and formic acid.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the risk isn't hypothetical, it's about volume. Ingesting as little as 10 milliliters, that's about 2 teaspoons of pure methanol, can cause permanent blindness by actively destroying the optic nerve. 30 milliliters, about an ounce, can be fatal.
So a responsible distiller knew this was poison and threw it out.
Absolutely. But a careless or greedy distiller, maybe trying to maximize volume or profit, might include it. And that could have devastating consequences for whoever drank it.
Okay, so after the 4 shots, what comes next?
Following the 4 shots, you get the heads. That's roughly the next 20 to 30% of the run. This part contains compounds like acetone and acetaldehyde. While generally not instantly blinding like methanol, these compounds are what cause those severe, debilitating hangovers that became kind of legendary with bad moonshine. They also need to be discarded, or sometimes they're recycled into the next batch's wash.
So you discard the first, roughly quarter to a third of the run.
Pretty much. Only the middle section, the hearts, that's the purest, cleanest spirit, is the desired drinkable product. And then finally, you get the tails. That's the last 20 to 30%. It contains oily, heavy compounds called fusel oils, which add off flavors and cloudiness. Those are also discarded or recycled.
So the whole process really hinges on the discipline to just throw away a significant portion of the product.
Discipline and knowledge, yes.
And there was another danger too, right? Lead poisoning. More insidious, maybe?
Yes, a more insidious and historically widespread danger was chronic lead poisoning. This was a tragic, almost structural consequence of the need for secrecy and limited resources surrounding illicit production, especially during the Prohibition era.
How did that happen?
Well, moonshiners would sometimes use old car radiators as condensers. They were readily available, cheap, and could be easily broken down and hidden if revenuers were nearby.
Ah, but the radiators.
Exactly. Those old radiators were soldered together using lead solder, and that lead would leach into the alcohol vapor as it condensed inside the radiator tubes.
And lead poisoning is cumulative, right? It builds up.
Precisely. Lead accumulates in the body over time, causing severe chronic health problems, irreversible neurological damage, brain fog, kidney failure, memory loss. The victims of lead poisoning often suffered chronic illness without ever knowing the source. It's a powerful illustration that the danger wasn't necessarily inherent in the corn whiskey itself, but in the illegal, makeshift, and dangerous equipment used to produce it under intense pressure from the law.
A really stark reminder of the risks involved. Okay, let's move into the era most people associate with moonshine. Prohibition, Part 3. Prohibition, bootleggers, and the law. Now, when we talk about moonshining, the national narrative usually focuses on the 1920s, the Volstead Act. But for our local focus here in Arkansas, it's important to remember that Arkansas actually got a head start on going dry.
That's a crucial distinction, yeah. The state of Arkansas passed the Newberry Act way back in 1915. That banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol a full 5 years before national prohibition took effect in 1920.
So the illicit market here was already up and running.
Oh, yeah. It was fully formed and operational when national demand just suddenly skyrocketed.
And the unintended consequences were
huge, massive. Instead of ending alcohol consumption, these laws created this unprecedented, incredibly lucrative demand. Moonshining was transformed almost overnight. It went from being a small, local farm craft, designed for personal survival, into a highly profitable, large-scale industry, often controlled by sophisticated criminal networks and organized crime.
This is the golden age of bootlegging.
Absolutely. Particularly in the remote areas of the South, like the Ouachita Mountains and the Arkansas River Delta region, our sources provide some incredible anecdotes showing the sheer scale of the operation. Infamous figures like Al Capone actually contracted with large-scale bootleggers operating right here in Arkansas to ensure a steady supply of high-proof whiskey for his clubs up in Chicago.
Wow. From Ashley County to Chicago.
Yeah. And this new scale meant that the distribution network had to function with, military precision and, most importantly, with extraordinary speed.
Which brings us to cars.
Exactly. The birth of stock car racing.
So what does this massive logistical demand for fast transport mean for broader American culture? It seems the necessity of distributing this high-value, illegal product and the absolute requirement of outrunning federal revenuers on those winding southern back roads spurred this incredible wave of automotive innovation.
It really did. The drivers, known variously as runners, blockaders, or sometimes trippers, they became true mechanical engineers in their own right. They didn't just drive fast cars, they fundamentally re-engineered them. They would meticulously modify their cars, Often Fords or Oldsmobiles were popular choices in ways that just defied the factory standard, all for speed and handling.
Okay, give us some examples. What kind of modifications are we talking about?
Well, they'd soup up the engine, obviously, installing high compression heads, custom carburetors to maximize horsepower, but crucially, to handle the massive weight of hundreds of gallons of concentrated liquid, which is incredibly heavy, remember, they had to reinforce the suspension.
Ah, so the car wouldn't sag and give away the cargo.
Exactly. They'd use heavy-duty springs, often taken from trucks, so the car looked normal even when loaded down.
Clever. What else?
They developed complex counter tactics, too. They installed hidden switches to control their brake lights, or even switches to dump oil or nails onto the road behind them to slow down anyone pursuing them.
Seriously, like in the movies.
Oh, yeah. And they had to be masters of concealment. Runners would install false floors, hidden compartments in the trunk or under the seats, and they often coated the cars in plain black paint to just blend into the nighttime roads. These were, by necessity and design, the fastest and most expertly handled cars on the entire road network at the time.
And here is that profound, direct evolution. These drivers, confident in their skill, their speed, the power of their machines, they started racing each other. Just for fun, bragging rights, prize money on the weekends when they weren't running liquor.
They were literally honing their evasion skills and testing their modified machines in these competitive environments.
And that practice evolved directly into the sport of modern stock car racing.
Directly. Early NASCAR legends, like the famous Junior Johnson, he famously got his start as a renowned bootlegger. He learned how to perfectly handle a fast car under intense pressure while hauling illegal cargo through the backwoods.
The irony is just stunning. Law-breaking giving birth to a celebrated national sport.
It really is.
Okay, before we get fully into local Ashley County story, let's quickly touch on the modern legal situation. It's still illegal, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial to pivot back to the present and reiterate that even today, the law is extremely strict. Federal law strictly prohibits home distilling for spirits, even if you're just making a tiny batch for your own personal consumption.
But you can own the equipment.
Yes, it's perfectly legal to own the equipment, a pot, a column, a condenser for non-alcoholic uses, like distilling water or essential oils. But the moment that equipment is set up and used to make alcohol, it's considered an unregistered still, unless you possess the proper commercial federal permits, which are expensive and hard to get.
And the penalties are still severe.
Yes, severe. Reinforcing that the government's concern is, just as it was back in 1790, primarily financial. Taxation. Violations generally fall under Title 26 of the U.S. Code and are typically classified as felonies.
Felonies, wow.
Yeah. You can face up to 5 years in federal prison and fines of up to $10,000 for the key offenses: possession of an unregistered still, engaging in the business of distilling without a permit, or willful tax evasion. The legal severity today really underscores that historical conflict.
Right.
It's still fundamentally about collecting the excise tax that was first levied centuries ago.
Okay, Part 4, Ashley County. A local history microcosm. Let's bring this rich national history directly back home now to the local story you wanted us to explore, specifically for the audience of Ashley County now. Ashley County seems like it was defined by this stark, really fascinating social and physical division centered around alcohol.
It really was. On one side, you had the traditional kind of rowdy frontier settlements and railroad towns, particularly Parkdale, which was known historically as Poplar Bluff. These towns were noted for being boisterous, home to saloons and that rough-and-tumble culture that often followed the rail lines.
And there's evidence of distilling there early on.
Yes, solid evidence. We have an account from January 1865 documenting that federal troops actually raided Poplar Bluff, the area now known as Parkdale, and they burned a standing distillery. That shows that commercial-scale production was already an established part of the local economy way back during the Civil War era.
Okay, so contrast that with the company town of Crosset. Very different vibe.
Completely different.
Yeah.
Crosset was the epitome of industrial temperance and, frankly, social control. It was founded by the lumber magnate E.W. Cap Gates. And Gates held this firm, almost paternalistic belief that a sober workforce was a productive and efficient workforce. He went to extraordinary lengths to keep saloons and the disruption they brought out of his immediate domain.
And there's that famous anecdote about Cap Gates in the church, right?
Yes, a classic piece of Ashley County history that highlights this conflict perfectly. The story goes, Gates learned that a saloon was planned to open just outside the legal town limits of Crosset, specifically to cater to his mill workers.
So what do you do?
He didn't just object, he mobilized his resources, he organized his workers, and they literally built a church building in a single day.
In one day.
One day. He then immediately used an obscure state law that prohibited alcohol sales within a certain defined distance of an existing church to legally block that saloon from ever opening.
Wow. Talk about using the system.
Exactly. And this single event created this profound, lasting contrast right there in the county. The wet, traditional, rowdy railroad culture versus the strictly controlled, paternalistic, industrial dry control exerted by Crossett.
Fascinating. Okay, now let's get into the Switzer story. This gives us that rare, source-documented glimpse into a mid-century Ashley County operation. We're talking about Frank Switzer, the father of the famous football coach Barry Switzer, right? From the memoir, Bootlegger's Boy.
That's the one. Frank Switzer ran a major bootlegging operation in Ashley County right after World War II. He lived in a modest house about 4 miles west of Crossett. His operation was substantial, but the key insight from the memoir, I think, is how it profoundly complicates that simple, white hillbilly making liquor stereotype we often see.
How so? What details emerge?
Well, the details that come out in Barry Switzer's writing are just crucial for understanding the local economic ecosystem back then. It reveals this integrated, really complex, and highly dependent local economy, albeit an illegal one. Frank Switzer's primary customers, and importantly his distribution network, were not exclusively white. They were largely drawn from the local rural African-American community members in the area.
Right.
Yeah. Switzer himself noted that he employed 5 or 6 black guys selling liquor for him and relied heavily on them for that local ground-level distribution throughout the county.
So it was an integrated, though illegal, business network.
Absolutely. And beyond just selling the liquor, Frank Switzer also augmented his income by acting as a kind of local, unregulated finance source. He made usurious loans to locals, both black and white, who were desperately in need of cash but couldn't access formal banking.
So it was a really intricate system.
Deeply intricate. A mutually dependent illicit economy where a white producer and financier relied heavily on a black distribution network and customer base to move product and solidify his financial power in those rural areas.
But despite the profit, there was still a social stigma attached.
Oh, definitely. The stigma remained potent, illustrating that moral dichotomy of the time. Frank Switzer was reportedly ostracized by many of his neighbors for his disreputable profession, and his illegal financial empire eventually collapsed. He was arrested by the Arkansas Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission and served time in the state penitentiary.
So his story is complex. Economic power, illegality, societal cost, racial dynamics, all wrapped up together.
Exactly. A complex testament to the realities of moonshine in mid-century Ashley County.
And even after operations like Switzer's were shut down, the identity, the legacy of moonshining, it persisted, didn't it?
It seems so. Evidence suggests that the moonshiner image was eventually kind of romanticized in Ashley County. It transitioned from being purely criminal status to maybe a badge of rugged local independence.
How do we see that?
Well, you see it in surviving cultural artifacts, like the documented existence of the Moonshiners Riding Club of West Crossett.
Or a riding club called the Moonshiner.
Yeah. For a community group to openly adopt that name, a term associated with felony tax evasion, it really suggests the term had fully transitioned. It moved from criminal status to this celebrated badge of rugged local identity, sort of celebrating defiance and skill.
That kind of cultural adoption only happens once the immediate legal and economic danger has faded into folklore, right?
Precisely. Once it's history, not current events.
And speaking of history, there's a frustration for local historians trying to piece this together, isn't there? Something about missing chapter.
Yes. We have to acknowledge that difficulty. We know from the sources K. Brad Barfield provided that a key local historical resource, Y.W. Etheridge's History of Ashley County, actually lists a chapter explicitly titled Moonshine in its table of contents. But frustratingly, the text provided cuts off right before that chapter begins. So the specific official details of local operations remain elusive, tucked away in lost records or, well, unwritten pages.
So local historians and enthusiasts, like Brad, have to rely on triangulating sources.
Exactly. You use the documented 1865 raid near Parkdale, personal memoirs that slip past the official narrative like Switzer's, and these surviving cultural artifacts like the riding club name.
Maybe even local folklore, like the Crossett Light.
Yeah, even local folklore like the famous Crossett Light ghost story about a railroad worker's swinging lantern. It shares thematic elements with those clandestine nighttime activities along rail lines, which were prime routes for bootleggers moving product in and out of the county.
So these echoes demonstrate that even where the official history is missing, the legacy of moonshining remains deeply embedded in the cultural landscape of Ashley County.
Definitely. It's part of the fabric.
Okay, let's wrap this up.
Right. So, to synthesize this incredible journey, we've tracked moonshine from its centuries-old cultural inheritance, this essential process for economic survival for frontier farmers who desperately needed to, as Brad put it, reduce the size of their cargo from bulky corn to highly portable whiskey. We followed it through a violent, centuries-long conflict with the state over federal taxation.
And that necessity, that pressure to outrun the law, it drove technological innovation in both chemistry and automotive engineering, eventually becoming the literal foundation of a modern, multi-million-dollar American sport, NASCAR. Today, we're fully immersed in what people call the moonshine renaissance. Legal distilleries are embracing and marketing the very outlaw image that once landed men like Frank Switzer in prison and, frankly, cost careless distillers their lives or health.
And the marketing is direct, it's compelling. You see legal brands, including Arkansas's own Delta Dirt Distillery, built directly on family histories of moonshining. The founders' grandfathers used illicit moonshine profits to purchase the family farm out of sharecropping, securing their economic future. That completes the full circle, really.
Yeah.
Illicit finance used to achieve the taxable American dream, transforming the spirit from an outlaw product hidden in the Ashley County forests to a branded, celebrated, and taxable heritage.
It's a powerful story of survival, logistical brilliance, and defiance. You now know the risks, the devastating neurological consequences of methanol and lead, and the primary motivation, which was often pure economic necessity. So as you consider the history of Ashley County in the South, think about this. When does a tradition of tax resistance transition from being a criminal enterprise into a celebrated, marketable heritage? And what other essential American activities were inadvertently born from trying to outrun the law? We want to give a special thank you again to K. Brad Barfield for providing the source material and suggesting this fascinating, locally focused deep dive for the audience of Ashley County Now. We hope this exploration encourages you to continue digging into the rich, complex, and often dangerous history of the spirits made right there in the pines of your county.